How avoidants struggle after pushing away the one who cared. We often talk at the heartbreak of the person who stayed, the one who loved, the one who gave. But what we rarely explore is what happens to the one who runs, the avoidant, the one who pushed away the very person who showed up with a full heart. Avoidants aren't cold-hearted. They're not immune to loss. They just deal with it differently. They disconnect from emotion like it's survival. But here's the twisting. After they push you away, that pain still finds them. It just shows up late, like a shadow they can't escape. Let's talk about what really happens to avoidants after they lose the person who cared deeply for them. When someone with an avoidant attachment style pushes away the person who genuinely cared for them, they don't always experience the pain of that loss right away. In fact, one of the most confusing aspects of the avoidant mindset is how disconnected they initially seem from the emotional weight of their decision. They may appear composed, relieved, or even indifferent, but underneath that calm exterior is a delay mechanism, not an absence of emotion, just a postponement. Because avoidants often experience emotional regret not as an immediate wave, but as an echo that arrives only after the dust has settled and the silence has fully set in. At first, they often feel a temporary sense of relief. They've escaped the vulnerability, the pressure, the closeness that triggered their fears. To them, distance equals safety. So when the person who loved them walks away or stops reaching out, they might breathe easier, mistaking disconnection for peace. But the reality is, cues, it's not peace, it's just quiet. And that quiet doesn't stay neutral for long. Soon, the silence starts speaking. A memory plays when they weren't expecting it. A familiar scent reminds them of your presence. They hear your favorite song in the background of a random setting. And suddenly their chest tightens, not because they're still in love, but because they never gave themselves permission to feel anything while they had you. Now, those emotions are backlogged, waiting for a way in. It's in these quiet, slow, unguarded moments that the regret creeps in. Not as a dramatic realization, but as a subtle ache. They remember the way you showed up again and again when they were distant. They remember your patience, your kindness, your emotional presence in the face of their emotional absence. They begin to feel a gnawing sense of, what if? What if they had leaned in instead of shutting down? What if they had said what they felt instead of hiding it? The worst part for them is that there's no audience for this regret. They can't share it with friends. They can't reach out and explain. Because admitting they pushed someone away who genuinely cared, someone who asked for so little in return, requires a level of emotional accountability they've spent years avoiding. So instead, they carry the regret quietly. It plays in the background of their lives like a song they can't skip. Regret, for an avoidant, doesn't show up in tears or apologies. It shows up in avoidance of new connections, in hesitating before trusting again, in moments when they subconsciously searched for what they had and pushed away. The echo of what you were in their life becomes a haunting reminder of what they never allowed themselves to truly experience. They may never say it out loud, but that silence they chose starts to back your name in ways they didn't expect and now can't forget. Avoidants have built their emotional world like a fortress. A strong walls, few windows, no open doors. They've learned over time, usually from early life experiences, that closeness feels risky, that vulnerability leads to pain, and that needing someone is dangerous. So when they find themselves in a relationship with someone who genuinely cares, it triggers something unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Their first instinct is to pull back, to retreat into the safety of emotional distance. And when they finally push that caring person away, they may believe they're regaining control. But in truth, they've just shut the door on the one thing that made them feel more alive, whether they were ready to admit it or not. What makes this even more complex is what happens next. Because while they may think they've avoided the emotional consequences, what actually follows is an internal storm they can't quite name. Emotional repression is the avoidance default setting. They've trained themselves to dismiss, bury. This becomes a numb feelings the moment they arise. But that doesn't mean the feelings disappear. In fact, repressing them only causes a deeper, more chaotic emotional build-up that eventually leaks out in ways they didn't anticipate. After pushing someone away, the avoidant often begins to field off. They can't quite put a finger on what's wrong. There's no dramatic breakdown, no clear label for what they're feeling. It's more like a constant emotional static in the background of their mind, a low-level discomfort they try to outrun. They distract themselves with work, hobbies, casual dating, even isolation. Anything to avoid sitting still long enough for their true emotions to surface. But the harder they try to silence it, the more persistent it becomes. What's happening internally is emotional confusion, feelings that were once clear in the presence of the person who cared. Comfort, admiration, connection are now tangled up in shame, regret, and self-doubt. And because avoidants often lack practice in emotionally expressing themselves, they don't know how to process this mess. They might feel sadness and mislabel it as boredom. They might miss your comfort, but call it loneliness. They may even feel jealousy when they see you move on, not realizing it stems from an unacknowledged love they never let fully bloom. Repression, in the long run, steals their ability to heal. Because to heal, you must feel. And avoidants don't feel in real time. They feel in delay, and only when it's too late to fix what was lost. It's like opening a bottle that's been shaken for too long. The emotions come out messy, unpredictable, and overwhelming. But instead of dealing with them, many avoidants will simply close the lid again and pretend it didn't happen. What they don't realize is that every time they repress those feelings, they increase the emotional gap between are and who they want to be. Deep down, they want connection. They crave understanding, but without the tools to process what's happening inside, they remain stuck, confused by their own emotions, haunted by their own choices, and unable to explain the H that never seems to go away. ChatGPT said avoidants often confuse independence with emotional freedom. To them, needing no one feels like strength. Relying on themselves feels like safety. So when someone starts to care deeply, it can feel suffocating. Not because the love is wrong, but because it threatens their sense of control. So they back away. They push, they distance themselves, believing that they're preserving their autonomy, their clarity, their peace. But what they fail to recognize is that the person they're pushing away was never trying to take their independence. They were simply offering intimacy. And once that person is gone, the difference between being independent and being isolated becomes painfully clear. In the early days after the separation, the avoidant may revel in the space. No emotional expectations, no check-ins, no vulnerability hanging in the air. It feels clean, light, free. But slowly, a shift begins to occur. The space starts to feel less like freedom and more like emptiness. There's no one to text when something funny happens. No one to decompress with after a stressful day. No warm presence to come home to. What was once a comfort zone starts to feel cold and unfamiliar. This transition is subtle. It doesn't look like heartbreak in the traditional sense. It's more of a growing awareness that life has become quieter, not in a peaceful way, but in a hollow one. Avoidants often don't have the emotional vocabulary to recognize this as loneliness. They just feel off, bored, or unsettled. But what they're really experiencing is the loss of emotional connection, the very thing they once told themselves they didn't need. It's in this space that the avoidant begins to realize how much that caring person brought into their world. Not in grand, sweeping gestures, but in the little things. Consistency, the gentle support, the ability to be seen and accepted even on their worst days. These realizations don't hit them all at once. They show up in small moments, making coffee alone in the morning, passing by a favorite spot you both used to visit. This becomes looking around and realizing no one truly knows what's going on in their life anymore. But here's the tragedy. Avoidants often don't know how to reopen the door they shut. Their instinct is to manage the discomfort alone, to lean harder into isolation rather than risk reaching out. And so what started as independence slowly morphs into disconnection from others and even from themselves. They lose the ability to share joy, to feel supported, to express love, not because no one is willing to give it, but because they've convinced themselves they don't deserve it or can't handle it. In pushing away the person who truly cared, they didn't just lose a relationship, they lost the emotional intimacy that made their world feel full. The independence they so fiercely protected becomes a silent prison, one with no visitors, no warmth, and now reflections of who they could be if they had let someone in. And once they realize it, the question isn't just, why did I push them away? It becomes, why did I think I'd be better off alone? Control is the ultimate illusion for avoidance. It's what they chase, what they cling to, and what they believe keeps them emotionally safe. They feel most secure when they dictate the distance, when they can decide how close someone gets and when to pull back. So when they find themselves in a relationship that starts to stir deep emotional intimacy, the alarm bells go off. Vulnerability begins to feel like a threat, not a gift. Their nervous system goes into protection mode and they start to retreat, pull away, shut down. Not because they don't care, but because they care more they know how to handle. Control becomes the lifeline. They rationalized their behavior with logic. It wasn't the right time. They were too emotional. I need space to breathe. They convinced themselves that their exit is justified, even noble, that the other person will be better off in the long run. But underneath all that rationalization is fear, the fear of being truly seen, the fear of not being enough, the fear of needing someone and then losing them. Control is a mask they wear to hide the chaos beneath. But after the person who cared is gone, truly gone, not just on a break, not waiting for them to come back, but fully emotionally detached, the illusion starts to crumble. The avoidant suddenly realizes that control didn't save them. It isolated them. They weren't protecting themselves from pain. They were preemptively breaking their own heart to avoid the risk of someone else doing it later. In the beginning, they may feel relieved to have regained their space, but that space slowly turns into a mirror. And that mirror shows them a version of themselves that's hard to face. Becomes someone who had love in their hands but couldn't hold it. Someone who wanted connection but only knew how to run from it. The illusion of control begins to feel like a cruel joke, because now they're left with the one thing they never wanting: emptiness. This is the moment where internal conflict sets in. Part of them wants to reach out, to explain, to rewind time. But the other part, the part that's still ruled by fear, holds them back. They worry they'll be rejected, that it's too late. That vulnerability will expose their inadequacy. So instead of apologizing, they stay silent. Instead of expressing remorse, they build new distractions, but nothing fills the space the way that person did, because that person didn't just offer love. They offered acceptance, safety, and emotional truth. The avoidant begins to feel stuck, torn between the need to protect themselves and the pain of losing something real. They wanted control, but what they actually needed was connection. And now that it's gone, they realize they never truly had power over the relationship at all. All they had was fear, calling the shots behind the scenes. And that fear cost them someone who was willing to stand by them, love them, and fight for them. Control kept them from getting hurt, but it also kept them from being truly loved. When someone genuinely cares for an avoidant partner, they often see beyond the walls, the defenses, and the guarded exterior. They see the softness behind the sarcasm, the kindness behind the detachment, and the vulnerability behind the emotional distance. They love the version of that person that few others ever get to see. And in doing so, they reflect something powerful back to the avoidant, becomes a glimpse of who they could be if they allowed themselves to trust, to feel, to love without fear. But when that person leaves, after being pushed away too many times, the avoidant doesn't just lose the relationship. They lose that mirror, that reflection. Becomes that version of themselves they didn't even know they had started to believe in. In the beginning, the avoidant may not recognize this loss. They think they're returning to their baseline, reclaiming their autonomy, regaining their emotional footing. But over time, they start to notice something's missing. Not just the presence of the other person, but the feeling of being seen, of being understood, of being believed in, even when they couldn't believe in themselves. That's the part that lingers. The fact that someone loved them not for who they pretended to be, but for who they were deep down. The version of them that was open, kind, emotionally available, even if only in fleeting moments. That version wasn't a performance, it was real. But it only came out because someone was patient enough, gentle enough, and consistent enough to make them feel safe. And now that safety is gone. Avoidants often pride themselves on being self-sufficient. But the truth is, they secretly loved how it felt to be loved in a way that required nothing more than their presence. To have someone see the best in them, even when they couldn't see it themselves. And when that person walks away, they're left wondering if that version of themselves was ever real, or if it only existed in the reflection of someone else's love. They may try to recreate that feeling in new relationships, but it rarely works, because deep down, they know that the connection they had wasn't just about chemistry, it was about emotional truth. Someone knew their fears and stayed anyway. Someone held space for their flaws and still chose to love them. And now that person is gone, the avoidant can't help but feel the void, not just of love lost, but of identity blurred. This leads to a subtle but persistent crisis. Who am I without the one who saw me? Without the one who loved the version of me I didn't even know how to love myself? That question echoes long after the breakup. It colors the way they look at future partners. It shapes the way they see themselves. And no matter how much they try to shut it out, it lingers, reminding them that love didn't just offer connection, it offered transformation. But that transformation required courage. Courage to accept love. courage to believe in their own worth, courage to lean into